Up to this point, Petscii Robots has been working on the Commodore PET, which was the original platform for the game, the Commodore 64, VIC-20, Commander X16, and even the Apple II. And in this episode, I'm going to show off the new version for the Atari 8-bit computers and the updated version for the Commander X16, and talk about some of the interesting challenges along the way. Around the time the Apple II version was going on sale, I was contacted by Christian Kruger, who was interested in doing a port for the Atari computers, so I sent him the source code for the PET version. And by the way, all 6 versions of the game have been converted from the PET version. A lot of people think, for example, that the Apple II version was converted from the C64 version, but it's not. The PET version is the easiest starting point because it doesn't use any graphics or sprites or fancy music. So, like a month goes by and I haven't heard anything, which is not unusual. A lot of people ask for the source code to my games, only to find that they're simply not qualified and they're in over their heads, and so nothing ever comes of it. Nevertheless, like a month later, I got this email from Christian saying, well, here it is, it's all done. So I was a bit skeptical, so I fired up my Atari 800 emulator and mounted the disc, only to find that, well, yes, it was done. He did an exact 100% port of the PET version. I mean, quite literally, it is identical, even the sound and music. The thing is, of course, I was expecting a bit of an enhancement since it's running on a much more capable machine than the PET. So we started talking about some ways that we could enhance the Atari version, and that opens a whole new can of worms we're going to talk about here in a minute. But about a week after the first port was done, I got this email from Blair Wilson, and he also attached a fully working version of the game. And well, here it is. And yes, it's basically a port of the PET version as well. Now the thing is, I didn't send him the source code, and no, he didn't get it from anyone else either. He had taken the PET version and ran it through a disassembler. Now what that does is it will take 6502 machine code and turn it back into a source code. Sort of. I mean, this is what it looks like. It basically just makes up random names for labels, and of course there are no comments of any sort. So this leaves a person with a ton of work to do because they have to try to figure out what each piece of code does and then try to document it themselves. And then he had to make the changes necessary for this to run on Atari. So I replied to him and I told him how impressed I was with his reverse engineering, and then I of course told him that, hey, if you just asked me for the source code, I would have sent it to you. Actually sent him a copy of it right then. And then of course I also told him that there was in fact an official port already in progress. Anyway, so back to Christian's port. Obviously, the first thing I thought we should do is improve the graphics and give it some color. However, this is where I found out my knowledge of Atari graphics systems was somewhat limited. To my surprise, I learned that the text mode on Atari 8-bit systems is monochrome, which struck me as a bit odd, being that I've seen color in so many different Atari programs. In fact, when I boot up my Atari, I'm presented with a blue screen. Well, it turns out the Atari allows you to select a global foreground and a global background color. But you can't change the color of individual characters. Sometimes some Atari programs will use raster control called display lists to change the color of a line of text, which gives the illusion of full color text. But you still can't control a single character's color. Of course, it is possible to get more color, but it comes with a great sacrifice, which I'll talk about in a bit. But first I want to tell you a little bit about the character set. So this is the Atari character set. It consists of 128 unique characters. And as you can see, it has uppercase, lowercase, and a few graphics characters. But it also has an additional 128 characters which are hardware reversed. So while it technically has 256 characters, the second half of those will always be a reversed image of the first 128. This behavior is actually identical to how the Commodore PET character set works, except the PET drops the lowercase character set in favor of more graphics characters. But the Atari does have one big advantage over the PET. These characters can be customized. Well, at least the first 128 can be. So it's really easy to load in the character set from the PET on the Atari, and thus Petscii Robots, that is the PET version, was relatively easy to get working on the Atari. So the question was, would it be possible to enhance the graphics like I did on the C64 and the VIC-20? Well, yes and no. The Commodore 64 actually has 256 completely customizable characters. It just so happens the default character set has the second half reversed so that it mimics the PET. But make no mistake, all 256 of these can be used however you want, which honestly still wasn't enough to really do what I wanted. But now I'm being asked to create a tile set using half that number. So rather than create a new program to do this, I just modified the existing tile editor I'd been using on the Commodore 64. I made it so the second half of the character set is always a reversed copy of the first. And then I worked for days to construct a tile set that makes the most efficient use of this setup. And believe it or not, I actually did the testing for this tile set with the Commodore 64 version, like this. I know, it looks weird with everything being in color except for the playfield. Nevertheless, this proved invaluable for the process. In the end, here's what the new Atari character set looks like. I'm actually using 100% of the first 128 characters, and then I'm using about half of the reverse characters as well. Now, if you're wondering what these 7 little square pieces are, these are just placeholder characters, and I'll explain that in a minute. And so here we go. Christian had spent some time working on the weapons and items display and used some sprites in those areas much like I did on the C64. And although those could technically be color, we both agreed that it looked out of place, so he went with a grayscale look. Also notice that we have a much nicer looking player character as compared to the little stick figure on the pet version. This is where those little 7 boxes come into play. The player is actually composed of 7 characters, but the player character exists in 8 different states of animation. So quite literally every time you move a tile, these 7 characters are reprogrammed on the fly. And believe it or not, that's exactly how the VIC-20 version works as well. Some people have said that it still looks like Petscii, but it's not. And I wanted to show you some screenshot comparisons between the PET and the Atari version, starting with this one. I'm just going to keep alternating these so you can see all of the changes. I mean, the side panel is sort of obvious, so no need to even mention that. But if you look at the floor, the crates, and of course the player character, you'll see the difference. Here's another view, this time an outdoor view, and you can see the grass and the trees look considerably better. And here's one last comparison. I mean, obviously the canisters are round and look nicer, but also the bathroom sinks look better too. So yes, it's still monochrome, it's still character mode, but I do think it looks a lot better than the PET version. However, at this point we were still using the sound engine from the PET. So Christian began working on enhancing the sound some, and here's what he came up with. There's no dedicated music track like the C64 and Apple versions got, so it still has the same musical track from the PET. In fact, the music is disabled by default, but you can turn it on with Shift-M. But the sound effects have been vastly improved. Plus the sound effects run on different voices than the music, so they don't interfere with each other. So one question is likely to come up, which is people are going to be asking, why is it that other Atari games clearly have plenty of color, and why Petscii robots can't? Well, these other games are likely using color tile mode or bitmap graphics mode, or some combination. Petscii robots could use these modes as well, but using color tile mode comes with significant trade-offs. For one thing, your horizontal resolution is cut in half, so everything would be a lot blockier. But the second problem is, in color tile mode, you sacrifice the reversed half of the character set, which I needed those desperately to make the tiles I already had. So it could be done, but Christian and I both agree the monochrome version was probably for the best. And now I want to show you this. This is an experiment from Blair Wilson using Atari's 5-color text mode. Now this will illustrate some of the things I was talking about. So obviously it looks chunkier, but that's not the end of the world. The two main problems are lack of available characters to use to draw any detail, and of course another problem that may not be as obvious, the Atari still has no color RAM like the Commodore machines have. So while you can assign one of 5 colors to a character in this mode, it will affect every instance of that character anywhere on the screen. So if you needed a red circle and a blue circle, you'd have to have 2 separate characters for that, which, as you know, are in short supply. As for the bitmap graphics mode, well, that could certainly be done. That's how the Apple II version works, as discussed in the last video on Petscii robots. However, this requires a significant rewrite of the display system, and that also means it would need more RAM, which probably means the Atari 800 would no longer be able to play the game. Quite frankly, Christian wasn't willing to commit to such a massive undertaking by himself, and I don't blame him. The Apple II version had a team of 5 people working on it, where the Atari version is basically just Christian and a little help from me. And so there we have it. This is Petscii Robots for the Atari. It's not going to knock your socks off or anything. I mean, visually, it's not the most impressive version of this game, but it does play very nicely. It's just as smooth and responsive as the Commodore versions, has all the same levels, and it's just as fun to play. And there is a tad bit of color used. When you take on damage, the background flashes red, and when you use the EMP, it flashes blue. This is consistent with the Commodore versions too. Also, the Atari version is compatible with this guy. It's a new adapter that will let you connect an SNES controller to the Atari. So, much like the Commodore and Apple versions, it can be played with an SNES controller. However, unlike the Commodore versions, these will not be included with every boxed copy. Of course, the Atari version will be cheaper to compensate. So, what kind of Atari setup will you need to run the game? Well, the basic requirements are 48K RAM and a disk drive. So that means most any Atari 8-bit system will work, except for the 400 and the 600 XL, because they don't come with enough RAM. However, if you're handy with a soldering iron, these can be upgraded to 64K, in which case should be compatible at that point. And now I need to talk about a matter of economics. So the Apple II port got its own box, its own manual, and the Apple II port also set me back about $10,000. In order to even break even, I needed to sell about 300 copies, which unfortunately I have yet to do. I've only sold about 260, where the Commodore version, on the other hand, has sold like 6 times that many. So I'm trying to be a little bit more realistic with the Atari version, and so this is the plan. I'm going to reuse the Commodore box, but I'll be putting a sticker over the fake sticker it already has, showing the Atari specs. I'll be reusing the Commodore manuals as well, since after all, most of the manual is devoted to the gameplay, which is the same on all versions. And I'll have an extra insert here for the Atari with some information that is unique to the Atari version. I do have a dedicated disc label for the Atari version. I went with a gray background to differentiate it from the Commodore and Apple versions. Now, funny thing is, this sort of thing was common practice back in the day anyway, so there's really nothing unusual about doing this. But anyway, hopefully this means I'll only need to sell maybe 150 copies to break even. So, moving along, let's talk about the Commander X16 version. In the last video on Petscii robots, I showed that I had ported over a color Petscii only version of the game. It used no graphics whatsoever, used the same sound system from the Pet, and worst of all, had this huge gap at the bottom of the screen. Now, of course, this was always just meant as a quick proof of concept, and I wanted to eventually have it look more like the Apple II GS port that was in the works, although that is currently stalled at the moment. So one problem with doing an X16 port is there's just a complete and total lack of tools. For example, it's really difficult to compose music for the X16 when there's no tracker available. So there's a laundry list of things like this that need to be completed before the game itself can become fully realized. The other problem I had with the X16 was somewhat unexpected. The video and sound systems in the machine are just so versatile. They might actually be too versatile. So I actually spent months trying to figure out which was the best direction to go, using which features to do what things, because I didn't want to get deep into a huge amount of investment of time into working on the game, only to realize I should have gone a different direction, because I'd have to start all over again. It'd be a big, huge waste of time. And so I was stuck for several months in something called analysis paralysis. For example, the video chip is a 3-layer system, and the way this works is you have the top layer that can work at any number of modes, such as text mode, graphics mode, multicolor tiles, etc. And then you have 128 sprites that live in the middle, and then a bottom layer that also works exactly like the top layer. So I tried to consider how best to construct a game like this, and I considered using full bitmap graphics like the Apple II version. I even considered using sprites for the playfield, since there's only 77 tiles, and the video system supports 128 sprites. I could literally make each tile a sprite, and then all I'd need to do is change the base address for each sprite to determine which tile it was going to display. The only reason I wasn't able to do this is that my tiles are 24 by 24 pixels in size, and the nearest size sprite would be 32 by 32 in 16 colors. So a lot of the sprite area would be simply wasted. Multiply that by 256 different tiles needed, and the amount of video RAM was actually 128K, which would leave me no room left for anything else in video RAM. So anyway, let me show you what I do have. The title screen is a 16-color bitmap image, and it's actually packed with an RLE compression system I devised just for this game. Another one of those tools I said had to be made, and so let's start the game. So as you can see, I've reworked everything so that it now fits the screen size properly. Now, let me tell you what you're looking at here. This part here is layer 1, and it's a bitmap graphics image. Now, this part here is text mode on layer 0. And this part here is all sprites. So you can see how I'm using the different layers of the X16. At the moment, I'm still using the same character engine from the Commodore 64 version with the same tile set. It looks pretty good, but it's still temporary. At some point, I plan to rework this part to run in bitmap graphics mode and borrow those Apple IIgs graphics I talked about earlier. But for the moment, it doesn't look too bad, actually. But anyway, hopefully it makes sense why, for example, the weapons and items displays look so much nicer than the playfield. So, about the sound, believe it or not, this is still more or less the same sound engine from the Pet. The only thing I added was the ability to set waveforms for specific sound effects. This makes things like the explosion much nicer. But this is all temporary as well. As you can see, I'm working on a tracker here now, which will allow me to design custom music and sound effects for the X16, taking advantage of its 8-voice PSG. At some point, I might even have music for the Yamaha FM sound chip. The tracker is still a work in progress, but as you can see, it is somewhat operational. Here's another thing we've experimented with. This code is by George Kirkham, and he wrote essentially a software emulator that allows the original game music for the C64 to work on the X16 sound system. Clearly, it isn't perfect, but it does work. But I think everything would be cleaner just to have a native tracker for the X16, so that's the route I'm going for now. And so the game is still in a transitional stage of development. I'm leaning heavily on assets from other versions of the game since I don't have all the tools needed on this platform, but it's getting there. And so there you have it. The Petscii robots have invaded nearly every 6502 based system. The only things that remain, if anyone would like to take the challenge, would be the BBC Micro, the Nintendo, and the Super Nintendo. I suppose it might even be possible to port it to the Atari 5200 and 7800, but I'm definitely not up to the challenge on any of these systems. That being said, I definitely plan to start an MS-DOS version at some point, maybe later this year. But that's it for this episode. I probably won't have another video on the channel until after I return from VCF Midwest. So, in fact, the very next video will be filmed on site at VCF Midwest. So stay tuned for that. And as always, thanks for watching.